welcome back to my channel. In today's video I want to talk to you about something that's very close to my heart, specifically non-verbal learning disability, also known as NVLD. Sometimes it's called non-verbal learning disorder, but non-verbal learning disability is what it's usually known as. It's more well known in America and talked about in America than in the UK, and there is an organisation called the Non-Verbal Learning Disability Project, which is actively campaigning for non-verbal learning disability to be an official diagnosis in the DSM, the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, because currently non-verbal learning disability is not an official diagnosis, but it is because it's not in any of the diagnostic manuals. It's more an educational term that is often used in special education and special education settings, mainly in education, and it's more talked about in America than in the UK. I have classic NVLD, like really quite severe NVLD, because I'm going to get onto that in a minute about what exactly NVLD is. Although NVLD was never used explicitly in relation to my problems growing up, because as I've already said, it's not a diagnosis as of yet. It should be, and it's more talked about in America than over here. And it's an educational term, and it's not really that well used in the UK, although I have heard it used in the UK, but it's not often used because it's quite a niche term that not even many people have heard of, because it is mainly, if you're in America, by the way, you may well have heard it more, because in the UK it's not talked about as often. But yeah, I have classic severe NVLD because when I was at school, I was special educate, what's the word for it, I was labelled or diagnosed, you want to call it, special educational needs, but revolving around this really severe discrepancy between verbal and non-verbal, sorry, I get my words confused. It's really severe discrepancy between really high verbal abilities and really low non-verbal abilities. So I have NVLD, because that is the cardinal feature essentially, and I have like literally all of the symptoms, and it really does need to be an official diagnosis, because currently you can't get diagnosed with it because it's not a diagnosis. If you're lucky, you will come across an educator who actually knows what NVLD is and will use the appropriate terminology. More likely if you're in America, less likely if you're in the UK. If you're in the UK, you're more likely to be called an enigma, like I was at school, because they cannot understand how a child can have such great verbal abilities and yet be absolutely clueless on non-verbal skills, particularly mathematics and reading comprehension and everything else. So I'm going to get on to what exactly is non-verbal learning disability, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So if you want to find out more, do go and check out the Non-Verbal Learning Disability Project, which is an American organisation, because that's where they do most of the research in non-verbal learning disability. And they are actively trying to get non-verbal learning disability into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders alongside autism and all the other conditions. I happen to have the double whammy of being both autistic and having NVLD. They can be standalone conditions, so some people have NVLD who aren't autistic, although it can be pretty bad even on its own. I'll get on to that in a minute, the distinction between NVLD and autism, and the relationship between the two, or I should say between NVLD and Asperger's to be more precise, because between Asperger's to be more precise, because obviously with the really high verbal abilities, you would need to have Asperger's if you were going to have it as well, alongside NVLD. So really I need to be quite explicit and say Asperger's. Annoyingly, they've got rid of Asperger's now from the DSM, which is not at all helpful at all in really talking about these matters, because it doesn't really help just to say autism, because obviously autism kind of affects people in so many different ways, and obviously those who can't speak or who really struggle verbally will be as far away from NVLD as it's possible to get. They'll have the complete opposite profile. So really I should say that it's possible to have both Asperger's and NVLD, which is what I have, which is kind of like a double whammy, because it obviously makes my condition a lot worse than if I were to have either on its own. So I'll get on to that in a minute. I'm trying to organise my thoughts coherently, so bear with if I'm going a little bit all over the place. I think I should probably start at what is NVLD, because I might be confusing people if I don't explain that up front, because the title in and of it does sound a little bit confusing, non-verbal learning disability. Some people get the wrong idea. They think it means you can't speak because they focus on the non-verbal bit. Completely the opposite. The non-verbal refers to the learning disability. It refers to the fact that the learning disability is specifically in non-verbal areas. Unlike a classical learning disability, where the person really struggles with verbal reasoning and verbal intellect, so they will find it hard to talk like what I'm doing now, or use long words, or being able to verbally reason. That's like a classic learning disability. It won't just affect verbal reasoning, it'll affect everything. That's known as like a general learning disability, which affects all skills. That's most people's understanding of a learning disability, but the most obvious indication of that will be that they will struggle with verbal intellect. So that's what often people see first of all. Non-verbal learning disability is the complete opposite. It's a specific learning disability, but it's still a learning disability, but a specific or partial learning disability in a sense that it only affects part of a person's intellect, the non-verbal domain, or in other words, the performance IQ. So the performance IQ is intellectually disabled. The rest of the IQ can be in a superior range. Not always. Many people with NVLD will just have an average verbal IQ, but the main thing is that the verbal will always be significantly higher than the performance. That's the hallmark of NVLD. Without that discrepancy, the person doesn't have NVLD. It's as simple as that. You have to have that discrepancy. Not just a discrepancy, but a clinically significant discrepancy. Because lots of people have discrepancies. Discrepancies in IQ are actually fairly common in a general population. In order for it to mean something, it has to be clinically significant. So it has to be more than just, a slight difference, which is quite common and normal. It has to be a massive discrepancy in order for that to be clinically significant. In my case, it's more than clinically significant. My verbal IQ is between, trying to remember now what it was, it's around about 140. My performance IQ currently is around about 66, okay? When I was a child, my performance IQ was in the 50s region. My verbal IQ was just above 100. So there's been a discrepancy when I was a kid and when I was an adult. Now the discrepancy is even bigger than when I was a child. And the bigger the discrepancy, the more severe the NVLD, basically. I've got a very severe form of NVLD, and obviously that explains all the problems I have in my life and why I'm so disabled, basically. So that is the hallmark. That has to be there. That is what NVLD is in a nutshell. There has to be a massive discrepancy between verbal and performance, and this has to correlate with significant difficulties in a person's life. Because it's possible, just possible, that a person might have a really big IQ discrepancy but no problems in their day-to-day lives. I mean, that's possible, but quite unlikely. So it has to also correlate with problems in a person's everyday life, which it does for me, and it has to correlate in the following areas, which I'm just going to get on to. So NVLD is a well-defined profile. Strengths in the verbal are contrasted with deficits in the visual spatial abilities, affecting organisation, attention, executive functioning, and non-verbal communication, with the emphasis on non-verbal. The whole point is that a person can speak extremely well. The person with non-verbal learning disability navigates through life using verbal skill. They talk a lot. Using language is the way that a person with NVLD navigates through life. They have excellent verbal skills, extremely eloquent, can use really long words, excellent understanding of language, often to a superior level, but non-verbally, absolutely screwed. So, they can, in a sense, come across as very intelligent, but this can fool people because the very, very high verbal skill can then make people expect them to be just as skilled in non-verbal areas when they're not. To some extent, you can use your verbal ability to compensate for some of the non-verbal difficulties through kind of finding workarounds through verbal ability, which I know I do. But there's always going to be this significant difficulty around non-verbal spatial skills, particularly in fast-paced, novel environments where the person doesn't have enough time to use their verbal skill to try and work around a problem at their own pace. This can result in people getting very frustrated, as I know all too well, like in voluntary work and things like that. When you often seem a bit spacey, you lose attention, struggle focusing, can't interpret instructions fast enough, can't find where things are, disorganised, all of those things. Okay, so I'm going to move over to video number 2 now, just to carry on talking about MVLD and its relationship to my problems. So moving over to video number 2.